As we turn on our televisions and we see the events unfolding in Israel, many of us are left wondering the question, is this it? Are these the end times? Is the book of Revelation coming true? And so what I want to share with you today are some things that most churches won't tell you about the book of Revelation. Things that will help you to understand what it's saying and what it's not, and how all of that applies to what's going on right now. So join me for this episode of Misreading Scripture. Now, before we start, if you're interested in learning more insights that will help you to understand the Bible more clearly and see it with an entirely new set of eyes, then make sure to click the link above and down in the description where you can download a free book I wrote called 10 Words That Will Change the Way You Read the Bible. It's a quick but powerful read that will teach you a whole lot in just a short period of time, just like this video. Speaking of, let's dive in. One of the biggest things that most people don't learn when it comes to the book of Revelation is how to read it. And let's be honest, right? If you don't get this, it's hard to get anywhere with this book. But the truth is, you can't really read the book of Revelation like you do the rest of the Bible. And that's because Revelation is an example of what is called apocalyptic literature. The apocalyptic movement began in post-exilic Judaism. That means after the Israelite people returned from exile in Babylon sometime around 538 BC. You see, after the Israelite people returned from exile, life didn't necessarily improve dramatically. They were no longer captives, but they were poor. Someone else was still in control of their land. They had no real power or authority. And as the centuries progressed, their situation didn't really improve. For much of their history, they believed that if they were obedient to God, they would be rewarded. And if they were disobedient, they would suffer. But this just didn't seem to be true anymore, right? They were trying to be obedient, but nothing was changing. And it's in this environment that the apocalyptic movement began to take root in Jewish culture. You see, apocalyptic theology believes that forces of good and evil battle it out until the end, and good will win over evil. So for the Jewish people, their situation was just an example of how evil had infiltrated the world. Their suffering suddenly made sense. It wasn't because they weren't being obedient enough. This was something bigger. Good and evil were at war. But this war wouldn't last forever. And they knew which side would win. So in order to read Revelation, we can't read it like a gospel or an epistle or part of the Torah. We have to read it for what it is, apocalyptic literature. And that actually leads to the next thing that most churches don't teach about Revelation, which is context. In order to understand any book of the Bible, it's helpful to understand its context. For instance, it's hard for us to understand why it's such a big deal for Jesus to reach out to the Samaritan woman in Mark 4 until we know something about the relationships between men and women and the relationships between Jews and Samaritans at that time. It's the history, the customs, the context that truly brings that passage to life. And this is just as true, if not in some ways more true, when it comes to Revelation. If we don't understand the context of these passages, we may never truly understand what they mean. And let me help you to understand why. For instance, imagine if I told you a story about an elephant and a donkey fighting. And what if I told you that it was a red elephant and a blue donkey? Well, if you live in America, you probably know exactly what I'm referring to. But if you live in a different part of the world, it might make no sense at all, right? And in the same way, someone living a few hundred or a few thousand years from now will probably have no clue what I'm talking about. They'd have to do all kinds of research to find references to red elephants and blue donkeys in American media in order to understand that I'm talking about political parties and not the animal kingdom. Right? A red elephant fighting with a blue donkey isn't some sort of secret code that has prophetic consequences. It's just a really specific reference to a culturally relevant situation. And if they didn't know that, then the best they can do is guess. Well, that's exactly the challenge we face when it comes to understanding an apocalyptic book like Revelation. If we read all of the images and symbols without any sense of context, we're doing little more than guessing when we try to interpret them. Right? Maybe we'll get lucky, but most likely we'll be totally wrong, and we'll be making conclusions based on wrong assumptions. Well, for the people living at the time that Revelation was written, they would have known exactly what the symbols and illustrations meant. Right? They were familiar symbols for familiar references. So in order to understand what they knew inherently when reading these books, we have to study the context of the world in which they live. So when it comes to Revelation, it's important for us to know that Revelation is written around 95 AD. A man named Domitian has become emperor of the Roman Empire in which they're living. He's declared himself Dominus et Deus, which means Lord and God. He's insisted on being worshipped. And many Christians who refused to do this were persecuted. Some were even killed. Well, it's within this period of suffering and oppression that John is inspired to write this book. These events are the backdrop. And it's these events that will help us to understand the symbols and images in this book, which leads us to the next thing that most people don't know about Revelation, which is the meaning of all of the symbols. You see, even if most people haven't read the book of Revelation, one of the things they probably know is that it is filled with many dramatic images and confusing symbols. But the truth is, these images and symbols aren't random or strange. They're intentional. Right? The people reading this book are going through great and terrible persecution. And these images and symbols are meant to convey the intensity of their persecution and the magnificence of their future redemption. I mean, think about it this way. How do you put emotions on a page? How do you convey in words the magnitude of what you're experiencing? Well, in the case of the writer of this book, you use images and symbols, right? You allow them to express what you have a hard time putting into words. And so let me break down for you some of the key symbols and images that you'll notice throughout the book of Revelation. Right? First, there are the beasts. Right? Beasts always represent nations. And similarly, horns represent emperors or kings or even just the power that these figures exercise. And by understanding the context of this book, we can actually determine which king or nation John is referencing. Right? Next, there are the numbers. 3 represents the spirit realm. 4 represents created order. 7 represents perfection or completeness. 10 represents totality or all of something. 12 represents the people of God. And 3.5 represents a time when evil is causing destruction and God's people are suffering. Finally, though, there are also the colors. White means victory, red represents war, black indicates hard times, especially things like famine and disease that can follow war, pale means death, and green equals eternity. Here's the thing though, be careful, because these aren't always hard and fast rules that are universally applied. There might be a moment when you see a number or a color that doesn't fit what I've just said above. Because remember, this isn't some sort of code that you're supposed to crack. These would have been familiar images and references for people listening. I mean, they would have recognized when to apply them and when not to. And to understand that, think about it this way. It's like how in English, we put an S at the end of most words to make them plural. But we also naturally know when not to do that, right? It's not deers, it's deer. It's not mouses, it's mice. It's not childs, it's children, right? We know the difference automatically. But people who don't normally speak English wouldn't understand it that way, right? They'd be confused as to why we broke our own rule. And that's what happens in apocalyptic literature. We're reading somebody else's language, something that they naturally understood, and we're better able to understand it the more we study it and the more time we spend with it. And that actually leads right into our final insight, which is purpose. And here's the tough news, right? The purpose of Revelation is not to predict the end of the world, at least not in the way that we imagine that. You see, as John watches his fellow Christians suffer, he writes Revelation in hopes of inspiring and strengthening their faith. He wants people to know that this is not the end of the story, right? Good is battling evil, and they can be certain which side will win in the end. See, Revelation isn't meant to be some sort of fantastic story about death and destruction in the end times. In many ways, it's bigger than that, right? This is describing the eternal battle of good versus evil, a battle that was raging in the first century and is still raging today. The words in Revelation aren't just meant for one people at one time in history. It won't just be relevant at some point in the future when prophecies and predictions begin to unfold. These words will always be relevant. The experiences of the people hearing this 2,000 plus years ago were eerily similar to the experiences many of us still face today. And where those people found comfort and inspiration and hope in the words of John, we can too. For some of you today, Revelation is a book that you desperately need. You're facing a lot of evil and a lot of pain in your life. You feel like the world is falling apart around you. You are oppressed and suffering, and you need words of hope. You need to know that you are not alone in this, that others are struggling with you, that others have struggled before you. And ultimately, the promise is the same for you as it was for them. While you may be walking in darkness now, it will not always be this way. Hope is on the horizon, right? We know how the story ends. This season, this age will not last forever. Good will conquer evil. God will rescue God's people. The promise is waiting right there in the scriptures. The question is, are you ready to read it? Well, that's it for this week. Thank you so much for watching. Now, if you haven't done so already, please take a moment to click the link above or down in the description and download my free book called 10 Words That Will Change the Way You Read the Bible. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, videos that will change the way you see challenging passages in the Bible, then just click this link right over here. Thank you again for watching. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.